Yishalmi zegt de meester dat Yud zijn. Al met bezig, niet maar als ik het was wel waarschijnlijk, geloof ik waarschijnlijk wel iets is de minibus, hij is zo Yerushalmי. So here we had an Amud Aleph on both sides. On Yuzayin Amud Aleph at the bottom of the Amud. Mishim Mata Mikal V'choyma. Kakolas Hatenim. Let's go back to the Mishnah. Said in the Mishnah, Machlokes Bezna Chachamim. From his Mafish Trumas Meises, those learning Malachta. Why? Because not like Malachta. There's no Gemara on something which is learning with Malachta. Even though Truma is Keveya, like we used to have bias, Divrei Chachamim, but Hanimili, there has to be something which is Nig Malachta. It's not Nig Malachta, not. That's a Machlokes of Bezna Chachamim. Chachamim say it's Mutter, and Bezna says even if it's not Nig Malachta, it's also Keveya. So the Gemara, the Mishnah, Chutz min Kakolas Hatenim. Kakolas Hatenim is different. What's anders Kakolas Hatenim? So we saw that what the Mishnah Shani says Kakolas Hatenim is because the person puts it in Kakola, so Meli is Ma'aprish. He wants it to be a Kakola, he wants to make it Truma, so Meli does the Dati Shel Odom. So even though it's Loinig Melachta, but the person wants it to be finished because he's putting it in the finished Kalim already. These are the Kalim which you put in when you want to use it at the end. You put it into such a keli which is used for finished products. So that's an override. That's like the Mishnah in Shayna. Kakolas Hatenim Shetom Mishim Mata Chamim Meisin. Chutz mi Kakolas Hatenim. But the Rambam in Pei Gimel Halacha Dalet Meisa. So he writes like this. Kein hatoyrim perish loinig memalachta mutter. Perish loinig memalachta is mutter because that's a chacham. Chacham argue with the blessed. We pass like the chacham. Perish loinig memalachta is mutter. Mutter lecham emare. Chutz mikakolas teinim. Except you put into a basket of teinim of figs. Shem tama koidim shetig memalachta nikva lemaisa. Tom doesn't give any reason behind it. He just passes like the Mishnah. They say in the Mishnah, it doesn't say any pshat like the Mishnah is saying that pshat that it should be chai because that's daita shalodom. Doesn't give you any clues here. In other words, what I mean to say is it would be like the Mishnah Shayna. The Mishnah Shayna is saying that that's the das or Adam. He puts into Kakola because that's a place where you're putting in the finished products. The Rambam would say something. Be mafar something. Only in a basket of figs. That's when we say this halacha that the chachamim are going to be masking. Why not? It's only an example because that's the dasa adam. The dasa adam you put into kakola. That's you have in mind here that the thing is finished. It would be something. Sabot from the Rambam would say that it's not only that. Anything that shows that this year das, that should be like that. Why dafka kakola? Dafka kakola. Only a basket.
It means that okay, just being das has to be like done to a minus.
Yeah, exactly.
It just be like
Exactly. So there's a Gemara here in the Vavamid base. We learned this Gemara, Vavamid base. We learned, it's happens when you learn. Ready to say that the Gemara is, they expect you to know. Maybe it's like Kriyishma B'Avin. Already when you learn the first mission, they expect you to know Kriyishma and all the halachas in Kriyishma. Maybe it's like Kriyishma. You didn't tell me that you have to say Kriyishma. That's to say that one from the way the Shas is written. So the Gemara says over here, Bava Mebeis, Imeni Mamala is a kli, Mishiyiklet Kol Tzorka, Kakola, a Kakola, 5 lines in the bottom on bottom base, Kakola Mishiyichafe. When is a Kakola Kibeya? Kakola, Zog the Pnei Moshe, Mishiyimale es a kli. Shaloikid boy, V'in Eine Mamala is a kli, Oicha Mamena Achiles Are, Ad Shiloikid Kol Tzorka. So the kli, this kalkola, which is the same idea, the kalkola we're speaking about in the Mishnah, you tell me that the kalkola makes it that is considered a dovish and nigma malach, even though it's not nigma malach, but the kalkola gives it a din of like nigma malach. But the Gemara here is saying the kli has to be full. Vishimalas a kli, shaloikid boy b'meinim amalas a kli. There's the words of the Pnei Moshe. Bo mebeis, it has to be full. What's a Coca-Cola? Coca-Cola is a sal. That's a basket. The Mafulda says here, Coca-Cola l'cholapes by Yirokis Koldov v'shedarko lukod b'sal, a basket. A Coca-Cola is a basket. Anything that is the normal way of assembling it, you put into a basket. So then the Gemara goes on here and says, Imenu malas hakli mishiyukot kol tzorkoi, Coca-Cola mishiyichafe. V'imenu mechafe mishimale es hakli. V'imenu male es hakli mishiyukot kol tzorkoi. So to the Pnei Moshe, what does this mean? Kakola l'chol ha'peiz ha'yokis kol l'chol davar sh'nukul b'sal. V'im chipe b'hasal b'alin zeh goyron. Yatavot. When you fill it up, or chipe, you fill up the kakola, b'alin, you put the alin is leaves, zeh goyron, that's considered goyron. V'imeni darka l'chavos, and it's not the way you put into this kakola, you put the topping on it, mishismala hasal, it has to be full. V'milikid b'sal imhabe achichape v'ismala kulan. Ozu goynon, af l'sal harishan. Then it becomes the goyin. The goyin is a measure, we'll see later in the Gemara here, we'll have the Gemara here later, that goyin is also a smacht in the Pasuk. There's the Pasuk in Micha that says that the goyin is kaveya. Goyin is kaveya. That's one of the ways how you can kaveya on Tumas and Maises. They goyin. What is a goyin? A goyin is a in other words, it's a finished product where you put it into the silo. That's the goyin. That could be over here also. The Alta Gemara says here on the above, the Gemara says the kakola. It doesn't mean just that kakola. Kakola means it has a din of a goyren. So maybe it has a din of a goyren. That's kaveya for ma'ase. Even though it's a double shloining of malachto, but if you put into the goyren, there's a smachta from the alimit akro from Pasuk over there in Micha that the goyren is kaveya. So that's why the Gemara is explaining here that this kakola is not just you put into a kakola. There's a shia how much has to go into kakola. If it's double shidaka l'chapa is you top it off with alin, you put the leaves on top of it, or you fill it up, the kakola has to be full. If it's not full, it's not a goyin. That is the word from kakola, and that's why it could be that the Gemara is telling us here, the Mishnah is telling us, that even according to Chacham, that say it's potter, it's not kaveh l'maise, if it's over shlein nigma malachta, however, you put into kakola, then it's nigma. Why? In other words, the Mishnah Rishonim is saying that he didn't find in any mechaber who says pshat in kakola. He didn't find anything. So he says the pshat is because that's the smichas das. It's showing you the smichas das. Could be nacha pshat. Nacha pshat could be. And we found it later, by the way. We found it in the Rash Shirila says that pshat. But here you see another pshat. The pshat is push it because kakola has a din of a goyren, and if it's a din of a goyren, so then you don't need to have that as a dover shenigum malachta. Once you put into the goyren, that alone, putting it to the goyren, is as if you made it a dover shenigum malachta. That the goyren is you're putting into a place where now it's going to be sold. That's the kakola. That is the kakola. This is the Gemara in Avama Medbeis. Okay.
So why is it talk about covering your out?
That's the derech here. This the other shit on the Gemara. The Gemara says here, Mishima Yerek Hanegad Mishiyugad. The Yerek Hanegad, something which is aguda, you take it and you tie it up because it's Yerokes. What's the shib Mishiyugad? After you tie it up, we may know. This is talk about Dobashning Malach. We may know Igid, and if you don't use these Yerokes, they're not used in bundles. They're not collected in bundles. Mishimalas a kli. You put into a kli, whatever you fill it up, and that's how you transport these yerokes, these vegetables, like whatever string beans, or however they're sold. You took everything that you need. However, kalkola mishichapa. You take a basket, mishichapa. V'yimeinu mechafa. Mishimalas a kli. It's not something which he tops off with other types of leaves or other types of things. It has to be full. Mishimal Sakli, Minimal Sakli, Mishil could call Soka. So you see, and the Manafud is learning Pshat here, because that's the Goyim. Kakol, the Chalapez, the Yokas, the Sal, in Chipubak, and Zeh Goyim, that's the Goyim. You mean Daka the Chap, Mishmal Sakli, so Zeh Medach, the Bot is, that's Goyim. And the Goyim, the Gemara says later, Goyim is a Dover, which is a Smachta, that's considered a finish. Yeah, the rest really here on Davam Vez says Kakola. Yesh Yerek Shein Dakila Ogdai. There are vegetables which you don't tie them up. Elanicha Kakola. You put it in, that's how you collect them. You put it into a basket. And Kusaba Pitrinoisa, Vidachlitim Kakola. These are names of vegetables. Mishichafa, Shichafa, Pia, Ba'alin, Ubuhutsin. You put on top, on the Kakola, you put certain branches. That's how it's sold. I needed the mighty Bepeda, so you don't know some Kakola. Also, it's talking also by fruits. It's the same idea. Okay, so more right. Okay, so we had here interessant. You sign on the base on the bottom. So Shimon has a kal v'chomer. Shimon says a kal v'chomer. Let's go back to the Mishnah. Keep going back to the Mishnah. You have to get this into the psyche. What are we talking about? So Kakola of Tainim is an exception to the rule, and then it's even something like Nigmate, it's Kaveh. Kakola of Tainim should tell me if Shimon Mate, if Shimon says even a Kakola of Tainim, he's not agreeing that a Kakola of Tainim should be an exception, and he says that it's also Mutter. But Chachamim, the argument of Lezer, they say no, a Kakola of Tainim. They say it's also Coca-Cola is overrides the thing that it's not Nigma. And Shimon says no. Why does Shimon say no? Why does Shimon say even Coca-Cola it doesn't matter, it's still mutter? So the Gemara says he has a kal v'chomer. Ma im bisho. There's 4 lines in the bottom of number 1. Ma im bisho. Sheyesh zika sholish maises ato im mutter. Meaning before you took off the trumas and maises, davish lo nigma v'nachtoi. It's not going to be mutter. It's not going to be chayiv. It's not going to be chayiv. It's not considered riyas habayis, even though you want to take off the truma, because there's still ma'aser. There's truma gedola, ma'aser rish, ma'aser sheni. In the table, you have these things. So it's loy nigma, it's loy hufresha. So then we say that it's mutter because not nigma malachta. B'shor sheni le'al zika shnei ma'aser is like all sheni. Avada, if you took off the truma gedola, and you only have the Ma'aser left, it's still Kaveh. So now the Gemara goes even further now. Now the Gemara says in Amud Aleph, Rishon, on Amud Beis, Rishon Ma'u Sheyitz V'Lisheni. What happens now if you have Rishon, only Ma'aser left? Aliba der B'Shimon Boy, Dr. Pnei Moshe, Im Hifrish Achikach Ma'aser Rishon, you took off the Ma'aser Rishon. Ma'u sheyikve le'isa be'achilas aray ad sheyavish ma'aser sheni. The efshe after Shimon hoyu the Torah mimenu truma u'ma'aser rishon koivim heim be'isa achilas aray ad sheyavish kol ha'ma'ases the koma the loy ha'bekal b'chayim le'Shimon. In other words, when is Reb Shimon's kal b'chayim? When you have three. He says, Madach, when you have three, you say it's not Kaveya. Avada, if you only have less than three. Now the Gemara wants to know, what's going to be by Rishon if you only have Ma'aser Rishon? Truma Gedolah was taken. Now you have leftover Ma'aser Rishon. Is this Ma'aser Rishon going to be Kaveya for Tebel or not? So what do you see? So he says, Atoim Mutter, but you have three. B'shoshen Aleh, Elazikas Ma'aser Echel Le'Kolshkein. Avada Gevis. If you tell me when you have a zika of two mices, you say that it's mutter, because he says in Dovish Learning Malachtoi, and Dovish Learning Malachtoi, even though there is in here leftover trumas and mices in the table, it's mutter. If you only have one mice left over, about it, we're going to say the word, Dr. Shimon, that it's still chai b'mices. Let's see the Pimash again. Rishon ma'u sheyitvel l'sheni. I'll leave the Reb Shimon boy. Again, and Reb Shimon is the one that says that because it's loy nigmir malachtoi, the fact that you put it into Coca-Cola doesn't do anything for me, because even though it's a goyin, even though it's considered that it's double shenigmir malachtoi because you put it into Coca-Cola. However, you're going to learn the chachamim were moided by Coca-Cola sateinim, and Reb Shimon says he's not moided. So then, for the Gemara. Why does Reb Shimon say that? So he says he has a kal v'chomer. Right? The Gemara, you have a kal v'chomer. What about if you have only rishon? I'll leave it to Reb Shimon boy. If you actually took off the ma'aser rishon, now what's going to be now with what's left over? Ma'u sheyikva le'eser b'achilas aray ad sheyafim ma'aser sheni. Maybe it's going to now be kaveya until you take off the ma'aser sheni. The efshe after Reb Shimon, he's going to be masking that it's also, it's called kaveya. The Torah mimenu truma u'ma'aser rishon. You took off the truma gedolah, and now you take off the ma'aser rishon. So do I say now he's going to agree that now it's already considered kaviyas because you took off two ma'ases? B'isa achilas arei ad sheyavish kol ha'ma'ases. The kama deloy the kal v'chayim v'Reb Shimon. He says no, doesn't matter. Al kapona, what you see from this Gemara now is not only is there in the tevel pshat you didn't take off the trumas and ma'ases. Tevel, for Reb Shimon, you see he has a kal v'chayim. How many is left over? You see that you have a shem of tevel before you make the afrosha. There's a shem in here of rishon, sheni, and truma gedolah. All three are here. That's another step in what we call the zika of trumas and ma'ases. Sagt der Nachfolger, Rishon ma'ashit v'l'sheni, the Shimon v'nir she'ein zoyt shayla gemura elashas masik hadvorim b'loshin shayla. He's saying it's not really a shayla here. He says because what's enough gemina? You have two or three. Shimon holds that it's not double shenigma malachta. That's not shenigma malachta. It doesn't matter. The zika is not going to matter. Dr. Nachfolger. It's just a form of a question. I don't know. He's not explaining exactly what's troubling him here. Dr. Rashidullah, Rishon ma'ashit v'l'sheni. I leave it to Shimon koi boy. Mi yamino and keeping the beside the ma'ases mafish vadei kova. We say that what the ma'ases vadei kova, according to the chachamim, the truma is kaveya. Truma is kaveya. One of the things that the rabbanon kaveya for ma'ases is truma. Forgot the Omer Shimon ain't aleh zikas gimos ma'ases. Even though the Shimon holds that we don't consider it that there's a zika here of ma'ases, Dilma. I love iketam the Shimon. Maybe that's not the real time. Elo the truma loy kova. Why? The ein hagoyden neka. In other words, what you want to do now, you want to take off the goyden. Elam kain tormin oisa. If you took off the trumas and ma'ases, then the goyden is neka. Well, hochinami ata b'kakola. Not because he wants it to be tevel. And it's called, in other words, nigma malachta. Even the mafish can say the tevel. If you take off the trumas and ma'ases, then it's considered tevel. Oidilma iketam the b'shimon mehocha. Umasi loylam loykova b'dafku. He says it's never going to be keva. It doesn't matter according to the b'shimon. B'shimon says something loy nigma malachta. There's no way to override that, and it's always going to be mutter. That's not considered the spare bias. Go to Maravayt. Shaido in the Mishnah, go back to the Mishnah, Rabbi say. Noch halacha. In other words, Mekach, okay, what now Truma? Truma is Kaveh Lemaisa. What about Mekach? Mekach is also Kaveh Lemaisa. So now there's a way of doing the Mekach. What does Mekach mean? Helech isizeh, the Lekeach tells the Moiche, Helech isizeh, take this coin, which is an Issa, v'sen li boy chomish tenim. Sell me 5 tenim for this Issa, this coin. If that's considered a Mekach, if the Lekeach says that, it's lo yoichel ad shiase dibur emeh. The mayor says, Mekach is Kaveya, so Mekach is not allowed to eat it until he makes Maisa, even though it's not Nigum Malachloi. I'm sorry, even though you don't have reason to bias, there's no reason to bias, but this is considered Mekach, the Chayim will goes on this, and they said this is also. And how is it also? He says, but this is to give me 5 tenim. This is in the Mishnah and Tez Zainam Al, Begudoime, Oichel Achas Achas Apota. Doesn't matter. He says 5 tenim. That is not considered something which is kiveya if he eats one at a time. In other words, the mekach has to be is a tzir for 5, that or more than 1. If it was 1 at a time, he's potter. So Yehuda brings a raya to what he says. There was a ma'aser beginners v'rodim. There was a garden of roses in Yerushalayim. That garden of roses was a very expensive garden. And what does the Mishnah say? Because they sold 3 tainim or 4 tainim for 1 issa. Very expensive. They sold it on the piece, and that's a very expensive price. And they never took off Tumas and Maises. Why? So they explain over here that what happened. This Guinness Rodim was a place where they didn't allow anybody to come in because they were concerned. It's very delicate and very expensive vegetables there. So the Balagina never allowed anybody to come in. If you wanted to buy, he brought out outside the garden. He gave you what you wanted to buy, and he gave you at this price. So why is it part of the Tumas and Maises? It's part the Mekach. A Mekach is Kiveya. Because it's being achas. It's so expensive. These payers were so expensive. You sold it by the piece, and if you sell it by the piece, it's not called something which is nikva. Even by Mekach, Mekach has to be a bunch. Not if it's 1 at a time. 1 at a time is not considered a Mekach. Here in the Moshe, in the Mishnah, the Kol Zman Shemakabel Lekech Achas Achas V'Oichel Ein HaMekach Keveya L'Maisa. It's not Keveya because one is buying it at a piece. Except V'Im Tzireh V'Kible B'Bas Achas Ozu Chayav L'Asa. If you do it at one time, more than 1 at a time, sure, then you say it is Chayav. So this is a machlokes here they made with the Buddha. The Meir is the one that says Achiyase it's also Mekach. Omu the Leipalaga Meir Ele Bizman Shabalagina who like it the Noiseloi Avanim Alakeh who like it local After Meir Moide like it Achas Achas. It depends on who is doing the sale. Is the sale being created by the seller, or it's being created by the Lekech, and the Lekech comes in and he tells you, give me 1 at a time. So let's see that's going to be our Gemara. Oh, here's what I was looking for before by Goyen. Have a look here on Tazayim and Aleph here in the Mishnah in the Rash Tzirila. The Rash Tzirila says in Tziril Chai. Ruda says Achal Achas Achas Reporter even by Mecca 1 at a time, piece by piece is Potter because Mecca is only Kaveh with a Tzirif. Tzirif is Chai. So what's Tzirif? What does it mean Tzirif? Well, why is Tzirif Yochai? The Kivin, the Tzirif in the right column on the bottom. Shtayim Biyodoi Mashri Goyim. You see, when you took 2 in your hand at a time, that is a goyin. A goyin means a place where you assemble the finished product. It's a Gemara pay test in Bab Metzia. We call the smachta. There's a smachta in the pasuk. What should the smachta in the pasuk? The goyin is machayev. Ki kopsen ko'ome groino. The pasuk in Micha. Mashma the ain't goyin b'lei kibbutz. A goyin means kibtza. That's the lashon pasuk in Micha. So we see that the word goyim, which is kaveya for ma'aser, that's the end product where you store the payers of the trumas and ma'asers. Those payers are stored in a goyim, in a silo. They ain't kibbutz pachas mishtan. Kibbutz, that's the lashon pasuk. Kibbutz and komet. That means two. So mainly you see, according to the ma'aser, the beginners with others. So Yehuda bought a ma'aser for ma'aser shahoya, the rose garden. You think of the rose garden in the White House. There was a rose garden yet in Yerushalayim, and that rose garden was famous for its delicate, expensive payers that they had there. The loiket achas been nois in lo yoya. He didn't allow anybody to come into the garden. They didn't want to destroy or damage the virod. So he brought it out and he sold it one at a time. So you see, where does this come from? That it has to be a tzidif, and there's no tzidif if we say that it's still potter, because Yoinon has to be more than one. So that could be the pshat in when the Gemara says that before, that like Kakola is considered a goyin, because once you put it into the Kakola, this is a goyin. That is the place where it's an assembly. So that's an assembly. So even though it's le'nigma malachtoi, zok the Mishnah that is maskim. And he says that it's a place that is, once you put in the Coca-Cola, everybody's going to agree that the Coca-Cola is mechayev you in Trumas and Maises. So Dr. Gemara, Hilach is Erev Zira v'Shem Reb Yochanan, Hilach v'Shem Reb Elazar. This is back on Yuzayin with Beis. Ma Peligin, when is there the Machlokes? Beloikid v'Noisen Loi, only Beloikid v'Noisen Loi. Then you have a Machlokes. In other words, the Moiche is the Loikid, and he's giving it to him. If the one who's doing it is saying, is the buyer is saying it, there's a tzidif. When is there a tzidif? When you give the money to the seller, this is one understanding. One of the Mishnah Shani says this pshat. You give it to the seller, give him money, and he sells you a bunch of tuah, either tuah or it's a tainim, whatever the thing is. So he puts it together, so that's considered a tzidif. You give him issa, and for that he sells you something. So he's coming to the seller, he puts it together, and he gives you what you bought, what you purchased. Ma'ashen came if the buyer is coming into the place, and he's picking by himself, like there's no tzidif, and then we say that he's takapota because he's shokan goyim. There's no tzidif. Let's see if there's the Moshe. Ma pligin and maybe Buddha. The machlokes in the Mishnah of the Meir and Yehuda that we say that it has to be a loikit, Baal HaGina, benois and leilakech. The Baal HaGina is giving it to the Mekech, like in Guinness V'rodin. That was the story. He brought it out to you. The Baal Tzvi later Meir, the Ab loikit achas benois and loy. The seller is giving it one at a time. Lo yochel achiyase. Why? The miyad when the seller he has the money for you, and then he comes and he's assembling the payers what you want to buy, and he's giving it to you. Now the next is the nigma. There's a tzidif. If it's the initiation of this transaction is the customer, he's coming in and he's picking it. He's allowing it, not against Brod. He's letting him come into the garden or wherever it's being stored, and he's picking up the payers. He's taking one at a time. There's no chalais kinyan because he didn't give him any money yet. He's picking them together, and then he's buying it. As he picks it up, that's when the kinyan is chal. But if he makes it tzidif somehow, then it's chal. The vote is that when do we say that there is a din that you are chayiv ima dovish le'nigma nachta a mekach? Mekach is an override, but it has to be a mekach of more than one. If it's only one, then there's no din of mekach is kaveh l'maisa. Why? Because it has to be a goyin. That's how the Rasul explains. If it's not a goyin, goyin means more than one. If it's one at a time, then that's why in Guinness V'rodim they held that Guinness V'rodim is part of Maises. They would never give up Maises because they never sold it by groups. They never sold it more than one at a time. And because you don't sell one at a time, that's not a goyin. So even mekach is not kaveya only when you have a goyin. If it's not a goyin, the mekach is not b'chayev. I get into it, but it says I gesund, clothes of.